My name is Jeff Morton. I've been serving the Lord since 1979. I have a website. It's called hearandobey.us. I also write a blog. The blog is jeffmorton.blogspot.com. I come from a perspective in my faith of going back and learning who our Messiah was as a Jewish man who came to us through the Hebrews based on the purposes of God and His creation. So everything that I do is to try to introduce to people literally the foundation of everything we believe. And so the term is called Hebrew roots for some. I'm not one of these people who follows a lot of the messianic crowds. I just simply believe that our Messiah was Jewish, and we need to go back and look at why and what that means. And what I've found in the past 6 years is that having done this and had some rather miraculous things occur that started all of this, learning about the Jewishness of our Messiah, why God created the Hebrew people, who Jacob really is, and what Israel is all about, when you start going back and peeling back the layers of things that we, quite honestly, weren't taught in most of the Christian circles that I, have been a believer in, it blows your mind. And so tonight I'm going to do something along those lines and just share something that's going to challenge some of you. Some of you are going to disagree with it. Some of you are going to be blown away. But it all has to do with how we look at the scriptures. And when you go into the Hebrew understanding, going back and looking at things, you start seeing parallels and themes and just a whole different understanding of the scriptures. Some people say it's the difference between a Greek understanding and a Hebrew understanding. But God purposed both. And since we as Christians have learned from a New Testament perspective, going back and looking at the Old Testament, which is really foundation, from a different mindset, will actually, the moment they see the difference, then the Bible becomes illuminated, almost as if a lighthouse has shined a light right on the scriptures, and it completely explodes in a way that, for as long as I've been a Christian, has never happened. And the trick is, our Messiah was Jewish. That's the key. So tonight I'm going to tell you about a dream I had. I'm going to tell you what caused the dream. I'm going to share some insights in the Bible that probably many of you have never seen before. Perhaps some of you have. I certainly hadn't. So what I'd like to do tonight is, first of all, I have been asking the Father, please explain to me why the church literally happened. What was behind the church? Because when you go back into the Hebrew, you realize that everything He did was through Israel, literally. And so how we ended up with a church and, the nation of Israel being reborn. So I've been asking the Father. Well, I was at one of our congregational meetings, and the pastor was speaking about Rabbi Shaul, or Apostle Paul, who was a Jewish man. He was a Pharisee. And in his presentation, he was talking about Paul getting off the boat in Athens, his trip to Athens, and seeing all the pagan symbols and all of the idolatry and all of the things that were just foreign from a Jewish perspective. And when he was doing that, this pastor is Pastor Art Palachuk, and he's Palachuk at El Shaddai Ministries. When he was doing this, I got an image of Rabbi Shaul, or the Apostle Paul, getting off the boat in Manhattan, New York City. And what he would see, not only from the context of being 2,000 years old in his understanding of things, but to see 2,000 years later the same pagan symbolisms and idolatry and literally Sodom and Gomorrah in many instances in New York City, in a Judeo-Christian nation. So it was with that vision, or that little momentary thing that I saw, that I began to ask the Father to explain to me How can we be a Judeo-Christian nation and tolerate a Sodom and Gomorrah mindset? So about 5 weeks ago, I had this dream. Now, folks, I've had some dreams, but this dream caused me to leap out of my sleep. And I literally was running around in this room that I'm in right at this very moment, trying to compose myself because the dream was so vivid. But in the dream, a meteor shot out of the sky, out of the heavens, and literally obliterated New York City. Obliterated. It was like an explosion that if you were standing on Jupiter, you would see happen to the earth. And over the course of as many weeks, the Father's been unpackaging that dream and my question about the church. Now, I come from a perspective that everything going on in the world today has to do with Israel. But in the dream, I saw 7 time periods, beginning with Egypt, and continuing all the way up through Western civilization as we know it today. In Egypt, for example, the Pharaoh had other gods, and God removed his people. We all know the story in Exodus. But then we had the Persian kingdom, we had Greece, Alexander the Great, the Macedonian, we had Rome, we had Constantinople and Emperor Constantine. This is probably about 300 years after the Messiah, which produced Islam and, for the most part, the Roman Church, Roman Catholic Church, or Catholicism, which Christianity in its form today was kind of born out of that. But then we had the British Empire, and that was when the empire was ruled by a kingdom as well as a church system. And then you have the West, or America. But these 7 periods of time in this dream that I had, the Father was pointing out to me that unlike Israel, who kept the Sabbath, kept the festivals, his holy days, Leviticus 23 declares they are his days. They, in essence, were never a Jewish holiday. And I'm talking about the 7 biblical feasts. Yom Kippur, Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Trumpets. These were his feasts, and he commanded Israel to teach us to do them. And so that, including his calendar, in this dream, he pointed out to me that neither Egypt, Persia, Greece, Rome, Constantinople / Constantine, the British Empire, or even the American West and Western civilization honored his Torah, honored his Sabbath, honored the holy days, and literally blessed Israel. And when I say blessed Israel as a whole, there are churches today that believe Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth. And as odd as that might seem to some folks, I deal with a lot of these congregations quite often. In fact, it's astounding how many churches in the United States of America believe that Israel has no right to exist as well. My purpose tonight is to unpackage this dream I had, and then to take you into the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, and show you what I was shown. And so anyway, in this dream, these 7 time periods didn't, according to what I was hearing, honor the God of Israel. That's the point he was making. In fact, he went so far as in this dream, he laid out 2 lists. One was, the subheading was Israel, and the other one was Jesus, or Yeshua, Messiah. And he made a comparison. Israel was born, the Messiah was born. Israel was commanded to take his word to the nations. And folks, just for the record, every time you hold up your Bible, you open it up, you look at anything written in there, the Jews did what they were commanded to do. That's why you have the book. Please kind of just park that in your thoughts while we do this. Anyway, they were to take that word to the nations, and they did. That's why we know the story. And a great sacrifice, I might add. But also the Messiah came and he taught the same word that they are taught us. In fact, the spoken word, the written word, and the living word never contradicted itself. So here we've got the Jews teaching us the word that Adam knew, that Abraham knew, that Moses knew, that we were now grafted into as a result of the Messiah. They were persecuted for doing that. Well, our Savior was persecuted. They were tortured for doing it. Well, our Savior was tortured. They were killed. In every one of those time periods, they suffered great indignation and were slaughtered, including Western civilization. Hitler comes to mind as the most recent example. This nation was born again in 1948, but during all of those time periods, there was always a remnant to Israel. Even when they were scattered, they never lost their identity. They are literally, for our purposes here tonight, a living miracle. And I think we've underestimated that. In 1948, we saw something happen that has never happened to any nation in the history of the world. Israel was born again. Well, our Messiah, he was killed and he was also resurrected, just as Israel was. Equally, they left the land, he left the earth. They're returning to the land, and his promises, he's going to be returning to Israel, I might add. So in that comparison between our Messiah and the nation of Israel, he showed me that they were not in opposition. But in the dream, he said, the church is not a part of this equation, which was kind of the answering of my question. Now, I'm not saying that there's no place for Christianity. I come from Christianity. But there's a beginning in Christianity that we're taught to explore in the book of John and certainly the New Testament. But when we go back to Genesis and we unpackage God's word based on a Hebrew mindset, what we have learned, as I've said earlier, it becomes, you can't even put it in words. The way the Bible is presented to us becomes illuminated in such a way that we begin to see what we were not shown, what we didn't know how to see, what we were not taught. And quite frankly, a lot of pastors, and I do this on a daily basis, don't know any of what I'm going to share with you tonight. So just keep that in mind, okay? And I'm not putting down Christians. I'm just saying that in a sense, I certainly feel like we were ripped off, because there's a whole lot of information in the Old Testament that I'm not even going to scratch the surface tonight. But anyway, in the dream, he said, and it wasn't him speaking to me face to face, and it wasn't a voice. It was as though I was able to communicate with a presence that was communicating with me. But towards the end of the dream, and this is the part that I can't encapsulate what happened in this format. But in the dream, he said, I warned you once with the hand of men. And he was talking about the Twin Towers in New York City. He said, I warned you twice when I brought the Twin Towers down using the hand of men. And then while he was speaking, he said, but this time, this warning is not cut from the hand of men. And a meteor flew past me. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. It was moving at light speed, and it obliterated New York City. Completely obliterated New York City. That's what caused me to jump up out of my sleep, and I've been like this ever since. But 2 weeks ago, I had 2 phone calls, 2 different people contacting me about what I do. And in both of those conversations, those 2 people mentioned David and Goliath. So I felt like I needed to read David and Goliath. So after I read it, I began to see parallels. And this is what often happens when you study the Bible from a Hebraic perspective. I started seeing things in the Bible that I knew but had never seen before. For example, and I'm going to get my Bible here. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, something interesting happens. Now this is Jesse. Saul has King Saul, and some of you are familiar with the story, King Saul had sent for David. So Jesse was calling David out of the field. But let me just read what it says, and I'm reading from the New King James Version. It says, and therefore Saul sent messengers, this is starting in verse 19, 1 Samuel 16, verse 19. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son, David, who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey, loaded it with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them by his son David to Saul. Now, I don't know if you caught that, but that was the first thing I read. So here we've got David, he's with the sheep, and the father, Jesse, removes him from the sheep, gives him a flask of wine and bread, puts him on a donkey, and says, here, take this goat and this bread and this wine down into the camp. If memory serves me correctly, our Messiah, who was is the shepherd, he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. And we have been taught that he is both the bread and the wine. In fact, the Passover Seder, the meal that the Messiah had, he broke bread and wine. So we see that inference in a couple of places. Joseph was in prison, for example. He had a bread maker and a cupbearer. Well, there's the story of the wine and the bread. Now, the guy who died was the bread maker, because in Deuteronomy it says the life is in the blood. So the cupbearer lived, the bread maker died. The same situation happened with our Messiah. He broke the bread, he asked us to remember it. His body was broken for us. So here we've got David, who is a picture of the Messiah, riding into a camp where there's a war going on, and he's taking bread and wine into the camp. So when I saw that, I went, okay, now I know the Father's about to show me something. But anyway, what happened next was I began to realize that the entire story of David and Goliath, on one level, we know it from a Christian perspective. Here's a boy fighting a giant, he kills it, dead. But if I were to show you that that whole story is showing us a picture of the great and terrible day of the Lord. In fact, I can now show you this because when I was reading this, this is what the Father was showing me. Now I have to give you some background as to what was actually happening. Goliath is a giant. The Bible, some translations say he's 9 feet tall, some say he's 12. But he's big. And he's standing on a mountain for 40 days and 40 nights taunting the king of Israel, Saul. But the mountain that he's standing on, when you go in and you do your homework, it says he was on Sakal, which belongs to Judah. Now, when Joshua carried the tribes into the promised land, Judah was given, all the tribes were given an inheritance, their land. This is the very land that Judah was given. Judah's one of Jacob's sons. He's the fourth born son, as a matter of fact. So anyway, 235 years later, we've got a giant in the land that was given to Judah, taunting the king of Israel. This is very, very important that you understand that. Now, that mountain that he's standing on is in what we call Gaza today. It was called Gaza back in those days. Now, the very name Goliath means splendor, someone who's beautiful, fully armed and covered in garments and just wonderful. Philistine is Galal in Hebrew, and it means immigrant. So here we have this giant immigrant in the land that doesn't belong to him, taunting the king of Israel. That's important, because we're going to see that playing out in our headlines today. Okay? Now, the root word for Goliath's name means one who, in fact, let me just read it for you. I looked all this stuff up as I've been studying this. But the primitive root for Goliath, or Galal, that's what Goliath's name means. I'm sorry, I misquoted there. Is to denude, especially in a disgraceful sense, by implication to exile, to uncover, to make gone, to remove, to reveal, to shamelessly uncover, as a matter of fact, to deprive of something important, to strip of all covering or surface layers, to lay bare. Now, the word Philistine actually is Pelishti. You can get that in Strong's H 643 or 6430, and it means immigrant. So here we've got this beautiful, tall guy who actually is about to be disrobed, and his name means to be shamelessly uncovered, standing in the land of Gaza on a mountain as an immigrant, taunting Israel. Folks, does that sound familiar to you today? Okay, when you go back and you study the Hebraic understanding of the Bible, you begin to see this cyclical pattern in every experience of human, for as long as we've been on this planet. God has been showing us the same story over and over and over again. So like today, there's a vote coming up on the 20th, I think it's the 22nd actually, to where they're going to create a Palestinian state out of the land of Israel. So I want you to keep that in mind as we continue here. Now, the mountain that King Saul is on with the armies of Israel, that's actually in the West Bank. That mountain is called, well, it says right here, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. But when you go back and you look at that, you begin to see, well, that's in the West Bank. That's in the West Bank today. So folks, I'm going to repeat this one more time because I want you to get a picture here. Here we have an immigrant who is not even, he's a foreigner to the land of Judah, in Gaza, on a mountain in Gaza, taunting the king of Israel in the West Bank. That's exactly what we're seeing in the headlines today. Israel's being challenged for a chunk of their land. But watch this. In Daniel 2, 31 through 35, this is the story about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel's describing this tall statue, and in some translations it says, "You, O king, were watching, and behold a great image, the great image whose splendor was excellent." Now remember, Goliath's name means splendor. So here we have a connection being made between Daniel 2, chapter 31 and 35, from a dream to now a physical representation of this giant whose name means splendor standing over before Israel. That's important. Again, remember I told you the Bible's cyclical. God begins to unpackage things for us when you start looking at it from a Hebraic concept. And I'm repeating myself on purpose because it's very important. I'm not looking at any of this from a Christian perspective. I'm looking at it as though I was a Jew in the land dealing with these circumstances. Okay? That's important. Now, Samuel, in 1 Samuel 17:9, Goliath's standing up there and he's going, well, I'll just read it. "If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall you be our servants." Folks, I don't know if you caught that, but this is literally the birthright, the inheritance between Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. And if you go back in Genesis 25:23, you'll see that those are the very words that was mentioned between Jacob and Esau. You serve me, I serve you. So I'm unpackaging something here that I want you guys to take a look at because you're going to see similarities as we go along. It says in Genesis 25:23, "And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separate from your bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger." Genesis 49:8 through 10 says, "Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you." Now remember, Judah and Benjamin got the birthright from Joseph. So here we have, we see kind of like the genesis of this birthright. And now we've got a giant who doesn't belong in the land challenging them for the birthright, and he's from that other nation. He's one of the sons of Ishmael. You've got basically two brothers on these two mountains. And Goliath is challenging, they want the birthright back. So in 1 Samuel 17:17, Jesse the father tells David to take 5 bushels of grain, 10 loaves of bread, and 10 cheeses to feed his brothers. Now that's important. Here we've got the youngest brother being commissioned by the father to go down into the camp where there's a battle going on to take food and nourishment and sustenance to his brothers. And the interesting thing about that is, in 1 Samuel 17:28, his brothers reject him. Does that sound kind of familiar, folks? I'll just read it. 17:28. And Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, "Why came you down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness?" There's a couple of things here that I don't have time to get into, but when it says, "And whom have you left those few sheep with in the wilderness?" that automatically tells me I got to go, why did he say few? And why did he say wilderness? So those are just key things that you learn to go back and look at, and sometimes it helps to go look at the Hebrew word in its original construct so you get a better understanding. Remember, I'm doing this from a Hebraic perspective. I know that as part of my study I have to go back and do that, because in the translations or the transliterations from Hebrew to Greek to now English, which didn't exist, a lot is lost. And that's why the Father wants us to study and go back and see. And the whole purpose of the study of Hebraic root is to go back and see. That being the theme of why I'm even doing all of this. But anyway, his brothers reject him. Well, it seems to me when the Messiah came in the flesh, his brothers also rejected him. Joseph, his brothers rejected him. You see this pattern throughout scriptures, okay? Now, a lot of times, what we do in Christianity is we go, see those Jews, they just couldn't get anything right. But I would submit to you, folks, that this is God's plan unfolding. And these events are happening because of who he is, not because of who Israel is, or what Israel does, or what Israel doesn't do. For us to sit in judgment of Israel while we read the scriptures that they presented to us is kind of, in my opinion, the oxymoron of oxymorons. And I'll just let you park that wherever you want to park it. These guys taught us everything, so we can't point a finger at them without understanding what the God of Israel is doing. Remember, in the beginning of this chapter, Samuel came onto the scene. If there was no Samuel, there would have been no David. So this is a plan unfolding. So to continue. In Psalms 118:22, it says, "The stone which the builders refused has become the headstone of the corner." Again, the brothers consistently rejected the Messiah. Anyway, back to the story. See if I got another connection for you. In 1 Samuel 25 it says, So the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who keeps coming up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel." Okay, now I don't know if you caught that, but there's 3 things that I'm going to point out here. Number 1, David's talking to the men of Israel. The brothers get upset because he's not in the field of the sheep. And they're telling him that whoever kills that giant gets to marry a bride. Okay? But also he gets the riches of the kingdom. And the most interesting thing, it says, he will be exempt from paying taxes. Well, if you understand the curse in the garden, Adam was now cursed and had to toil for his wages. He had to toil the land in order to feed himself. Here, that's being lifted. So we see a wedding, we see great riches, and we see a lifting of a curse. When I saw that, folks, I got really excited because I've read this story hundreds of times. I've never made those connections. In fact, in Matthew 22, verse 2, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king which made a marriage for his son. Revelations 21, verse 9, and there came to me one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials full of the 7 last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. And then in Revelations 21:4, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. The reason I threw that verse in here is because the whole story of David and Goliath is David killing a giant and Israel being set free. Anyway, David goes in to speak to King Saul in 1 Samuel 17:33. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. Well, let's take a look at that verse. Israel became a nation again in 1948. That's the miracle of our modern existence in the world. But it's a young nation. So in this exchange between Saul and David, Saul is saying, You're a young nation. This is an ancient enemy. In fact, this is an ancient enemy that is sitting in the land given to Judah. He's an immigrant, and he's come up to challenge the birthright. Folks, does all of this start sounding familiar? Those of you who know your scriptures will make connections here, even if you don't study the Hebraic concept. But anyway, we got a youth who's getting ready to do battle with an ancient enemy. Okay? So now let's keep going. Goliath says to David in 1 Samuel 17:44, And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. Well, here's a giant threatening Israel with throwing his flesh to the birds. It seems to me that somewhere in scriptures, we'll get to that in just a minute, but David's response, now remember this is a boy. In 1 Samuel 17:46, David says, No, I think you got that wrong. This day will the Lord deliver you into my hand, and I will smite you and take your head from you, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day to the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the air, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Now remember, folks, I started this out by telling you I was asking God to explain the church. Here we see the God of Israel. In Deuteronomy 28:26, And your carcass shall be meat to all fowls of the air and to the beasts of the earth, and no man shall fray them away. Ezekiel 39:17-20 says, As for you, son of man, thus says the Lord God, Speak to every kind of bird and to every beast of the field. Assemble and come gather from every side to my sacrifice, which I am going to sacrifice for you as a great sacrifice on the mountains of Israel. Notice he didn't say the mountains of Egypt or the mountains of New York. Mountains of Israel. Remember, this battle is happening on 2 mountains. That you may eat flesh and drink blood. You will eat the flesh of mighty men. Well, I'd have to say Goliath was a mighty man. He's pretty big. And drink the blood of the princes of the earth. Now remember when, right there, the princes of the earth. Remember my dream. 7 periods of time. I'm going to connect all of this in the way that the Father connected it for me a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, you can see here that the very thing that Goliath says was going to happen to Israel, David responds and says, no, this is going to happen to you. And then if we go through the scriptures, we can see that that great final battle, the Battle of Armageddon, we see that the birds are going to eat on the dead for 7 years. Luke 17:26 through 37. As in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. They ate and they drank and they married and they were given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, as it was in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they brought, they sowed, they planted, they built. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. I told you in the dream that I saw a meteor shoot out of the sky and destroy New York City. Remember that. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day let him who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away, and likewise let him who is in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to gain his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will preserve it. I tell you, in that night there will be two in one bed, and one will be taken and one left. There will be two women grinding together, one will be taken and the other left. And the disciples said unto him, Where, Lord? He said to them, Where the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Now, I don't have time to get into this, but there's some very interesting things that are revealed here out of the mouth of the Messiah himself. He said the first one to be taken, the first one to be taken goes to where he'll be slaughtered. That's a very interesting phrase, and there's a lot more I could get into, but that's not the purpose of this presentation. Jeremiah 34:20, I will give unto them into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of them that seek their life, and their dead bodies shall be for food unto the birds of the heavens and to the beasts of the earth. The reason why I broke all that down for you folks is because the very thing that Goliath said was going to happen to Israel actually ends up happening to the Philistines. It's kind of like Hitler. Hitler had the Jews shot in the head and then burnt, and their bodies cremated. Well, Hitler was supposedly shot in the head and his body was burnt. And see, the connection between God's people and his enemies is amazing. You'll find these parallels throughout scriptures. And keep in mind, some of you folks know this. I could be just talking to the choir, but for the most part, I know many Christians don't know this stuff. They don't make these connections. I deal with this on a daily basis. And so my whole purpose is to just reveal these things so we have another way to look at what God is showing us. 1 Samuel 17:48, and it came to pass when the Philistines arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistines. Okay, folks, I got to paint a picture here. We got a giant with an army standing on a hill in Gaza. We have King Saul standing on a hill in the West Bank. King Saul is not doing what he's supposed to be doing, and the army is scared and fearful. In fact, there's a scripture that says in 1 17, verse 16, and the Philistines drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. I don't know if you caught that, but that's 40 days and 40 nights. The Philistines stood there taunting Saul, and he didn't do anything. So now we got David, this boy, who's facing this entire army on a different mountain, and he sees that those folks are starting to advance. And Scripture tells us that he runs out. Doesn't say the army ran out. Doesn't say that Saul said, let's go. It says this boy ran out. Anyway, in Joel 3:16, the Lord also shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake, but the Lord will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. When you read that verse, folks, and you realize that David was the hope of his people, and he had no fear. But what's even more interesting is he was obeying the law. He was obeying the commandment. It says in Leviticus 24, verse 16, and he that blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him, as well as the stranger, as that he that is born in the land, when he blasphemes the name of the Lord, shall be put to death. So here you've got David keeping the commandment. He's the one who picks up 5 stones. He's the one who roars out of the camp to face an entire army. And he does it because he's operating in the spirit, whereas King Saul is operating in the flesh. Now, there's different ways to understand King Saul. I would suggest to virtually everybody who's hearing this, hear how the Jews teach about King Saul. In fact, I think it's a mistake, and it has been for 2,000 years, that we have not sat at the feet of our Jewish brothers and listened to them. They didn't get everything right. We don't got everything right. It just doesn't work out that way, folks. But for the very people that taught us the story, for us to throw them under the bus for 2,000 years is a little ridiculous. Especially, they've been teaching us for 3,800 years. Perhaps it's time for us to listen to what they offer. After all, we're reading the words that they wrote. Anyway, going back to our story, in 1749, and David put his hand in his bag and took there a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead and he fell on his face to the earth. Okay, I don't know if you caught that, but he didn't bend down and pick up the stones. He was carrying them. And the stones represent, in my opinion, based on what the Father showed me, they represent the first 5 books of the Bible, which is commonly referred to as the Torah. In the Greek, we call it the Pentateuch, but our Messiah was Hebrew, so I'm going to keep that mindset going. David picked up 5 stones, but if you go back and read the account of Joshua, 235 years earlier, he defeated 5 kings in the exact same mountain, in the exact same area, the same battle. David picks up these 5 stones and he's carrying them with him. Now, many of you have heard, well, Goliath had 4 brothers, and that's all true, and that's, for all intents and purposes, applicable here. But for my dream, the Father made me aware that those 5 stones, and the reason he wanted me to pay attention to them was because they were 5 smooth stones. They were just not rugged old rocks. They were 5 smooth stones. Something had been done to them to make them better than jagged and rocky. But David had them. He was carrying the word, the instructions, the Torah, the law with him. And the other thing about this is David fell face down. He fell in front of this boy face down. Kind of reminds you of the scripture where it says every knee shall bow, every tongue confess. If you haven't figured it out, I'm showing you the parallel between David, and we all know that there's a parallel between David and the Messiah. But I'm literally showing you the events that the Bible tells us are going to happen in the last days. The Messiah is going to roar out of Zion, and he's going to defeat the giant. Okay? Psalms 68:21, but God shall wound the head of his enemies, and the hairy scalp of such as one as goes on still in his trespass. Psalms 110, verse 6, he shall judge among the heathens. He shall fill the places with the dead bodies, and shall wound the heads over many countries. Habakkuk 3:13, you went forth for the salvation of your people, Israel, even for salvation with your anointed. You wounded the head out of the house of the wicked by discovering the foundations to the neck. This is about Israel, just as it is today. On September the 22nd, they take a vote to take a great big chunk of Israel's land and give it to immigrants who don't belong in the land. 1 Samuel 17:47. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So David goes out there with rocks. He doesn't go out there with an army. He doesn't go out there in full battle gear. He goes out there with rocks. In Hosea 1:7, but I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. He went out there with rocks, guys. David reaches down, he picks up Goliath's sword, he cuts off the head. Now remember, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, a rock shot out of the heavens and crushed the feet. And the statue fell amongst itself. It became a mixed pile of rubble. But this particular giant in the dream has been the enemies of Israel for centuries. David signifies, to me anyway, and I would suggest for this presentation, that he cut off his head once and for all, ending the rise of these nations. So anyway, to kind of bring this, there's so much more here, and I would suggest you read 1 Samuel, the entire book, to find out how Samuel came into the picture, how Hophni and Phinehas, the high priest's son, didn't do their job, and the Lord said, he actually said, this is going to cause an enemy to come into my camp. And here we have 17 chapters later, Goliath. But anyway, back to the dream. When that stone, that rock shot past me and blew up New York City, that morning that I read this, the Father quickened in my spirit saying, that meteor you saw is no different than the rock that David shot into the head of Goliath. Now, folks, I don't know about you, but we've seen the Twin Towers come down. If Rabbi Paul got off the boat today, in today's world, he would see harlotry and paganism and just about everything under the sun. But the seat of the nations surrounding Israel today is the United Nations complex in Manhattan. It happens to be on the opposite side of where the Twin Towers were. And so the connection for me in this dream was that what I saw was the same rock that David picked up, only this one was the one the Messiah hurled. And he destroyed the nation systems that have come against Israel, from Egypt, Persia, Greece, Rome, Constantinople and Constantine, the British Empire, and Western civilization. In my dream, the Father was showing me that these are the systems that did not keep his Torah, did not keep his Sabbath, did not honor his holy days, and have not honored Israel. So I don't know about you folks, but when the Father says, I will bless those who bless you, Abraham, and curse those who curse you, David in this dream was a picture of those civilizations, of those time periods. And that meteor came and put an end to them. And the Father was saying that his kingdom was coming. His Son was coming. And he was going to defeat all of the enemies in the land that were attacking his nation. And he didn't say the church. Remember, folks, we're grafted into the nation of Israel. We're grafted into them. And his feet shall land on the mountains of Israel. So when you go back and start unpackaging the Bible from a Hebraic construct, you begin to see these parallels. I just showed you a wedding ceremony, lifting of the curse, a Messiah roaring out of the camp to defeat an ancient enemy. And he did it with a rock not cut from the hand of men. So we've got meteors. There's talks of meteors in the news. I'm not so sure I want to jump on those bandwagons. But I can say this with absolute certainty. Right now, Israel is completely surrounded by giants. And they are trying to take the West Bank. And they're trying to do so in the name of the Palestinians who are living in Gaza. They're saying that Israel is occupying the land, when in truth, according to Scripture, David killed an immigrant who had come up out of the land that the Messiah is to inherit. He comes from the tribe of Judah. David is the king, the king who came out of Judah. The Lion of the tribe of Judah is going to roar out of Zion and destroy everything that comes against Israel and all of those grafted in. So this is a lot of information to kind of put together in this format. I'd like to thank Jason Swafford for helping me do this. And when I do these kinds of things, you got to understand the way that I operate. I'm just trying to convey to you an experience and my thoughts. I don't stand in front of crowds and teach on a daily basis. I do the best I can with the information the Father's showing me. But my prayer is that every Christian hearing this will go back and look at the Hebraic understanding of the Bible. And I guarantee you it'll do this. It'll begin to fill in holes. It'll begin to connect dots. So here I just presented to you a scenario that is yet to happen, but has already happened. And that's what's so fun about studying the Bible from a Hebraic concept. You begin to see the circular or cyclical patterns in the Bible. I'll give you just to name one more along those lines. The Bible says that the Messiah was the first fruits. He says Israel was the first fruit. Well, plants came up out of the earth on the third day. Well, Jonah came up out of the belly of the fish on the third day. Esther prayed and fasted for 3 days. The Messiah walked out of the tomb on the third day, and Abraham and Isaac walked for 3 days. Each one of those events happened on Passover. But if you don't understand God's calendar and his holy days, you won't make those connections. So, but even more so, the number 3 signifies restoration or redeemed. So in all of those events, something was restored. Israel, the war between the worlds in 1945 ended. The nation of Israel, and I don't think this is a coincidence, was resurrected, reborn, born again in 1948. The difference, folks, and I'll close with this thought, is 3 years. When we start looking at how God does things, it really will blow your mind. God bless you. Thank you. And I'll see you in the kingdom.